Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Today's subject, the mother of dragons herself, Daenerys Targaryen. Now, as I stated in my previous video, this episode's gonna be less of a rewrite and more of a restructuring or reframing, if you will, as I felt all of the potential pieces for Dany's arc were present in the show, and that the failure was more on the part of the showrunners and directors, who didn't fully understand or were unable to convey Dany's inner conflict between her desire of being a just ruler, who uses diplomacy to win over the people, and the more violent aspects of her personality that always seem to be bubbling just below the surface. Now, of all the what the fuck moments in the final season chock full of nonsensical character decisions, there is one that I can confidently say stands above the rest. Following Dany's burning of King's Landing in episode 5, reactions were polarizing to say the absolute least, with some fans considering it a complete betrayal of a character they spent nearly a decade watching rise from a young girl sold off to marriage to one of the most powerful forces to be reckoned with in the land, and whose deep empathy for the oppressed would never allow her to hurt the innocent. While other fans cited the numerous examples of Dany's non-magnanimous and at times tyrannical actions throughout the series, characterizing her as an egotistical and brutal conqueror who has no qualms about resorting to violence if it stands between her and her goal. Now, personally, I thought Dany's destruction of King's Landing was perhaps one of the most contrived and nonsensical events of the entire series, but I'll get into my own reasoning later in the video. However, after reading Lord knows how many reaction articles about the scene, I was surprised to find that, well, I kinda saw both sides. On one hand, I felt the show did constantly frame Dany as a victorious ruler whom the audience should be rooting for, but on the other, there are plenty of moments where her competency as a ruler was put into question. So what explains this polarization? Well, after analyzing the novels and Dany's entire series arc, and while I stated in my last video I would do my best to not constantly compare the show to the novels, I believe this is primarily as a result of the poor translation of Dany's character from the page to the screen. So I will be referring to the books quite a bit. Each book in the series is split into chapters, each featuring a single character in first-person POV, which allows the author to just flat out state what a character is thinking at any given moment. Now, while a television adaptation obviously can't do this, the entire craft of adapting a piece of writing for the screen is to translate a character's inner thoughts in a visual way. And, in my opinion, the series colossally fails at doing so, especially when it comes to Dany. In the novels, Dany's arc is one of the most nuanced of all the characters. Even at 13 years old, she's 16 or 17 in the show, a change that was made for rather obvious reasons, Dany is portrayed as a girl who is very mindful of her past and the person she wants to become. Having learned of the madness of her father, Aerys II, aka the Mad King, and witnessed the cruelty of her brother Viserys, Dany is adamant about not allowing her more tyrannical tendencies to overcome her, even as her numerous failures of diplomacy cause her to grow increasingly frustrated. And despite her desire to become a magnanimous ruler, she's also only 13 years old, and thus her ego, naivete, and even her budding sexuality all interfere with her attempts to do so. Let's take a look at Dany's development throughout the TV series to see if the show is able to do her character justice. It doesn't. In Season 1, we see Dany develop from a coy, helpless girl to a confident woman who has earned the respect of her Khalasar and, after the death of her husband Khal Drogo, rises to be the leader they need. However, we see right at the start of Season 2 Dany's aggravation at her inability to be an effective leader, as is evident by her embarrassingly failed attempt at gaining access to the city of Qarth. And even after she is allowed into the city due to the actions of Xaro, she discovers she was merely a pawn in a plot to steal her dragons and take over the city. Now, while the first 2 seasons are quite faithful to the novels, there's a small but extremely important divergence in the books and show regarding Dany's exit from Qarth that is indicative of the writer's failure to understand her character arc. In the show, following her escape from the House of the Undying, Dany takes revenge on both Xaro and her traitorous handmaiden by sealing them inside Xaro's vault. She then loots Xaro's riches, and her and the Dothraki leave Qarth on their own terms. However, in the book, following her escape from the House of the Undying, the city is enraged with Dany's actions, and Xaro, who does not betray her in the books, warns her to leave the city so as not to put herself in needless danger. Dany and the Dothraki leave the city empty-handed. So in the show, the showrunners treat Dany's time at Qarth as a semi-victory, whereas in the book, it's an absolute failure, and serves as the start of Dany's inner turmoil in recognizing that she may never be the ruler she wishes to be. But it is in Season 3 where the showrunners truly begin to lose their grasp on Dany's inner characterization. In Season 3, Dany travels to the slave city of Astapor and considers buying the Unsullied army at the price of one of her dragons. Though she agrees to the deal, she immediately turns the army on the slavers. Now, while many of you show watchers will remember this scene as one of the best of the series, and an extremely satisfying one at that, this scene has, or rather is supposed to have, a dark implication that the show doesn't truly showcase. In the books, following her failure at Qarth, Dany is growing impatient with her own inability to lead effectively, and she feels the Dothraki are beginning to lose confidence in her, and thus, the darker aspects of her personality, the ones telling her to take what she wants by force, are starting to creep creep forward from the back of her mind. In the novels, Dany was told of a prophecy by Quaithe when she was in Qarth. The prophecy states, "To go north, you must journey south. To reach the west, you must go east. To go forward, you must go back. And to touch the light, you must pass beneath the shadow." Now, there are many interpretations as to what the literal meaning of this prophecy is. However, this quote is used as a motif in the novels to represent Dany's urge to give in to her conquering ways, her persona known as the Mother of Dragons, the violent itch in the back of her mind, the one she continuously tries to suppress in favor of a more non-violent approach to diplomacy. In the book, the night before Dany is to make the deal with the slave master, she has a dream where Quaithe repeats to her the same prophecy, and thus, the next day when the exchange is to be made, Dany resorts to taking the Unsullied and killing the slavers by force. Now again, it's not like the slavers didn't deserve to be burned, but this marks a step toward the dark side for Dany, realizing that, as her dragons go stronger, and she is able to exert more force and fear in those who oppose her, that perhaps being a peaceful diplomat is not who she truly is. This is further supported by her follow-up action of taking Yunkai by force, which is where she meets Daario Naharis, who will come into play later. Now this is all extremely clear in the books, but in the show, none of this is really evident. Her burning of the slavers is treated as more of a total victory, instead of the double-edged sword it's really supposed to be. To give further evidence to the idea that George R. R. Martin didn't intend for Dany to be considered as the total good guy in this scene, in the show, she tells the Unsullied not to harm any woman or children, but in the book, she tells them not to harm any children under the age of 12. Like, holy fuck, there goes the Losers Club and the squad from Stranger Things. Jesus Christ, Dany. And unfortunately, this oversimplification and whitewashing of Dany's characterization is only the tip of the iceberg. And this brings us to Meereen. Now, I think both book and show fans can agree that the Meereen plot is one of the most polarizing plot lines of the entire series. While things are escalating in Westeros, it seems as though Dany's storyline is just spinning its wheels, and the plot's lack of causality towards the others is testing the patience of the audience as to when the hell she's going to get her ass to Westeros. However, the Meereen plot is essential to understand how we arrive at a more volatile and vengeful Dany that could be capable of committing the destruction of King's Landing. On her way to Meereen, Dany sees that the nobles of the city have crucified 163 children on the road to the city. Upon triggering a slave revolt and taking Meereen for herself, she orders that 163 members of the noble class are to be crucified in an act of, as she puts it, justice. Again, while at first glance we as an audience may say fuck yeah to her sentiment, after thinking about it for more than 2 seconds, you realize how ridiculous of a move this is. Perhaps some of the masters had nothing to do with the crucifixion, and were just as appalled by the sight. Perhaps some of them were doing their best to change the ways of Meereen by reworking the system from within, as we later find out is in fact the case. In the books, we understand this naive idea of justice is a result of Dany's darker persona getting the best of her, and even she realizes that she may have made the wrong decision, trying to justify her rash actions even to herself. From A Storm of Swords, she had them nailed to wooden posts around the plaza, each man pointing at the next. The anger was fierce and hot inside her when she gave the command. It made her feel like an avenging dragon. But later, when she passed the men dying on the posts, when she heard their moans and smelled their bowels and blood, Dany put the glass aside, frowning. It was just. It was. I did it for the children. But in the show, it's just sort of glossed over, and its relation to the progression of Dany's characterization isn't really addressed. It's like the showrunners were like, well, this happens in the book, so we should put it in the show, but then totally ignore how it affects Dany's inner conflict. But fuck it, who needs character development? Following her taking of Meereen, Dany receives word that the cities of Astapor and Yunkai, both of which she took by force, have or are beginning to revert to their old ways. This is Dany's sort of wake-up call, where she realizes that she has let the darker aspects of her personality blind her from realizing that just barging her way into a city and then peacing out doesn't do any good for the people. From the book, all I have brought to Slaver's Bay is death and ruin. I have been more Khal than queen, smashing and plundering, then moving on. This is also right around the time that Dany's dragons are growing large enough that she's having trouble controlling them, a parallel for the dragon within her starting to make her lose her grasp on her senses, causing her to make harsh decisions. And this is why she decides to stay in Meereen and rule, because Dany, having realized that she has allowed the darker side of her to control her for too long, must prove to herself that diplomacy is a viable option, and she can grow to be a wise ruler loved by the people just like her brother Rhaegar was, instead of a brutal tyrant as her father and brother Viserys were. And in order to do so, she must suppress the dragon within her, which is symbolically represented later on when Dany decides to lock Viserion and Rhaegal in the Meereen dungeon. Again, the show has her do all these things, but the conflict within Dany isn't established well at all, or is only displayed very briefly. It seems as though, and I would say as is evident by Emilia Clarke's performance, the directors and showrunners don't really understand the complexity of what's going on in Dany's head when all of these things are happening, and how all of this second-guessing herself will eventually lead to her becoming the more violent queen we see in the last 2 seasons. And that last dig isn't at Emilia's performance at all. As we see in Season 8, she absolutely has the acting range to display plenty of emotion, but in Season 5 in particular, it seems like she's always either dripping with sociopathic egotism, or looks kind of slightly concerned. And I feel like this is due to the lack of direction she was given from the directors and showrunners who didn't really understand the deeper context of the scenes. So Dany stays in Meereen, and as we all know, things go to shit pretty quick. The Sons of the Harpy begin a guerrilla war against the city, and Dany does her best to try and understand the complexities of ruling a society. Now I'm going to stick with the show Meereen plot because the book Meereen plot is a lot. It's far more detailed with a lot more players and has a lot more complexity. But this is sort of the point. Dany in the books is completely overwhelmed by the complexity of the politics of Meereen. She can't keep things straight, she starts to second guess herself, all of which seems to be building to something at the end of the book. Remember that. In the show, it's pretty stripped down, but the same theme is still there. Dany is having trouble juggling the complexities of Meereen. Again, the problem is that the writers don't do enough to really explore what's going on in Dany's head, which makes a lot of her contradictory actions during this season seem like it's less her struggling to figure out the politics of the city, and more like she's struggling with an extreme case of bipolar disorder. For example, in early season 5, in a plot that is not present in the books, a member of the Sons of the Harpy is captured. Dany initially decides to execute him, but Barristan persuades her to give him a fair trial, implying that killing him is something that her crazy Targa's father would do, which is exactly what she's trying to avoid. But then one of the former slaves goes ahead and kills the Sons of the Harpy member before the trial can take place, and so Dany executes him, which causes the lower class people to turn on her. Okay, hang on, wait, hold up. Okay, so Dany, as to not end up like Aerys, spares the Sons of the Harpy, but then she decides to execute the former slave? I mean, I guess the former slave admitted to doing it, but there's no scene with Dany contemplating the ramifications of the action. She decided against killing the Sons of the Harpy due to the optics of the situation, yet she didn't seem to understand the optics of killing the former slave? Why not just imprison him? Why are you trying to pander to the Masters? To make the Harpy killing stop? Why would the Masters ever respect you again, seeing as, oh gee, I don't know, you indiscriminately decided to crucify 163 of them with no evidence or trial, like less than a season ago? Okay, but let's just give the writers a pass and say, well, they're trying to portray Dany as conflicted about how to rule and yada yada yada. She's trying to be a just queen. But then after Barristan is killed by the Sons of the Harpy, she decides the best course of action is to take random leaders of the great families and have one of them burned and eaten by her dragon? That is completely the opposite of what she did like an episode ago. Well, maybe this is a sign she's reverting back to her old ways. Well, no, because in that same episode, she decides to reopen the fighting pits in an effort to appease the Sons of the Harpy. Which, again, why would they, seeing as you just indiscriminately killed a random leader without any sort of trial or proof? But then later in the season, after she meets Tyrion, there is that line about how she wants to break the wheel and disintegrate the big houses of Westeros. But this doesn't make any sense because the whole point of Dany trying to placate the Sons of the Harpy was to create unity between the nobles and the lower class, and Jesus fuck! Dany's supposed to be conflicted by the complexities of running a society, not struggling with the simple concept of cause and effect. Book Dany's decision-making isn't nearly as erratic as show Dany's is. Book Dany is doing her absolute best to avoid resorting to any sort of violence to solve the Meereen situation, using instead compromise and conflict mediation even while tensions within the city begin to escalate and enemies from outside the city begin to close in, even as she feels that her own morals and principles are beginning to be compromised. Her inability to govern effectively is driving her up the wall, and the dark side within her is trying to make its way to the surface. The side that's telling her to just burn it all down and crush her enemies with an iron fist. This is further illustrated in her relationship with Daario, another subplot the show pretty much fucking botched. In the show, Daario's more or less Dany's fuck buddy just because, whereas in the book, Dany is struggling with being disgusted by Daario's barbaric suggestions to solve her problems, yet being extremely lustful for him, and she begins to fear that it is the violence within Daario that's turning her on so much. So Dany's failing miserably at governing governing Meereen. And it all comes to a spearhead in both the book and the show at the fighting pits. In the show, Dany is attacked by the Sons of the Harpy, and just before she's to be killed, Drogon arrives and saves her, carrying her away on his back. But in the book, there is no Sons of the Harpy attack. Drogon shows up on his own accord after hearing the screaming and violence from the fighting pits. The Meereenese people, fearful of Drogon, lose their shit and start trying to attack and kill him. This is the big moment for Dany. It is where she must decide between Drogon and the people of Meereen. In response, Dany mounts Drogon and flies off with him. It is Dany who saves Drogon in this moment, not the other way around. And then, both in the book and the show, Dany flies Drogon away from Meereen, which is where she's found by Khal Draco. Now this is where the books end as of now, so let's quickly recap Season 6. Dany is brought to Khal Marrow, who, after discovering she was the wife of Khal Drago, command her to be sent to Vaes Dothrak, where widows of former Khals must remain for the rest of their days. Dany, seemingly starting to revert back to her old, let's burn this motherfucker down self, burns the Khals and takes back control of the Dothraki. She then returns to Meereen and, well, we see just a bit of a change in Dany's personality.
I will crucify the masters. I will set their fleets afire, kill every last one of their soldiers and return their cities to the dirt.
Wait, what the fuck? In Season 5, Dany was all diplomatic and shit, wanting to resolve the conflict in Meereen via non-violent means. But then at the end of Season 6, she's going all Targaryen Hitler. Even the script notes that Dany is a completely different person than she was in Season 5. So what happened in Season 6 that would explain this? I mean, she goes to Vaes Dothrak, and being in the presence of where Drogo originally pledged to take the Iron Throne for her seems to make her revert back to Season 3 Dany, where she's more of a conqueror than a diplomat. But again, this seems to happen way too quickly and suddenly. What made her change her mind? Well, remember when I said that the removal of the Tysha confession was one of the few big omissions from the book that completely altered a character's inner conflict and characterization? Well, what if I were to tell you that Benioff and Weiss, in all their infinite fucking wisdom, did it again? They made what may have seemed like an inconsequential book omission, and yet it causes a major gap in Dany's character arc. In the show, when Dany flees the fighting pits and lands God knows where, she just sort of walks around for a hot minute until the Dothraki eventually find her. But in the book, this is the most essential scene in Dany's arc. In the book, Dany is starving and sick and begins to hallucinate, having visions of her brother Viserys, Jorah, and yes, Quaithe, who repeats to her the same prophecy she said to her in a dream just before Dany killed the slavers of Astapor. It is during these hallucinations that Dany is told by pretty much all three of them to remember who she is. This is the moment where Dany realizes that the Meereen experiment was a cataclysmic failure. In the fighting pits, she decided to save Drogon rather than let the Meereenese kill him. She chose her dragons. This is the moment where Dany remembers who she is. She isn't some magnanimous diplomat selling herself away to marriage and dining like a royal highness. She is the motherfucking mother of dragons. This is the moment where Dany has finally let her darker persona take control of her, and she has completely, or let's say mostly, given up on being some snooty patootie highborn acting broad who plays the political game. This is break the wheel Dany. She realizes that by chaining her dragons away and pretending to be someone she's not, that she has betrayed her true self. In a line from the book, after Drogon torches a horse of one of the Dothraki that find them, and Dany and Drogon begin to feast on the horse. In Meereen, I was a queen in silk, nibbling on stuffed dates and honeyed lamb. What would my noble husband think if he could see me now? His Dar would be horrified, no doubt. But Daario, she has finally fully become the mother of dragons, who will use whatever she must, fire and blood included, to free all of those subjugated to the chain. This is the Dany we see return to Meereen in Season 6, ready to crush some skulls. And it is this Dany we see in Season 7, which is very evident in her conversation with Jon in Episode 3. She isn't fucking around anymore and isn't gonna play the diplomacy game. It's her way or the highway. So yeah, it's not so much that the actual story events of Dany through Seasons 1 through 6 was bad per se, it's that the writers didn't really seem to understand what the purpose of the character beat progression that Dany goes through was. Or if they did, they weren't able to successfully translate that to the screen. Again, the skeleton was there, but they didn't really nail the character beats well enough. You can't just constantly ask the audience to guess what's in a character's head and speculate wildly as to what the motivation behind their actions are. It's almost like doing so may result in people taking away totally different personality impressions from a single character. And the real shame is that it really wouldn't have been that hard to communicate Dany's arc to the audience. Just add a few more conversations with Jorah or Barristan or Daario, allowing Dany to speak her mind and demonstrate what's going on in her head. And as for the scene after she flees the fighting pits, just have her hallucinate her conversations. Shows do this all the time, and it's a completely acceptable way of showcasing the inner monologue of a character. One of my favorite shows, 6 Feet Under, does this constantly, with the main character characters who run a funeral business having imaginary conversations with the dead people whose funerals they're coordinating, allowing their inner thoughts to be showcased. In addition to failing to communicate Dany's inner character development, I feel the showrunners and directors got a little carried away with framing Dany as a victorious queen throughout the run of the show. What with the music and the shots of awe, or riding her dragons, or commanding her armies, all of her enemies being reduced to comically evil bad guy tropes didn't help matters either. As a side note, I'm frankly surprised the more extreme liberal crowd didn't lose their shit when they realized they were cheering on some pale-ass white girl torching her way through a population of pretty much solely non-white people. Oh, son of a bitch. The one thing you have to give the show is the production value is stellar. And in some cases, yeah, I think they went a little overboard. So when you watch these scenes, you're so emotionally charged with the dragons and the armies and whatnot that you may not really let Dany's actions sink in. You may be so entranced by Dany walking out of the fire with her newborn dragons in season 1 that you kind of forget that she burned Miri alive the night before. Who, yeah, she killed Dany's husband and baby, but her explanation as to why after the fact, I mean, it kinda makes sense. Or in season 2 when she leaves Karth, you may forget that Xaro and Dorea are currently screaming their lungs out in a dark vault, their deaths creeping ever closer with every step that the Thraki horses take. Or when she burns the Masters of Astapor, you remember that when she later killed the Masters of Meereen, that many of them were actually innocent, and you realize that she probably killed a shit ton of innocent people in Astapor too. So yeah, the music and all that kinda makes it seem like the show's like slay queen, but then you look back and revisit what she actually did and it kind of puts it in a different light. And this is sort of also the reason why it kind of comes out a bit more in the book, because there's no music and there's no visuals and all that stuff, so you kind of take Dany's actions at pretty much face value, or at least more so in the book than the show. So these are the two main reasons as to why I felt a lot of people had different interpretations as to what sort of person Dany was coming into the last 2 seasons. So now let's get to how her story arc comes to a close. So Dany, now the mother of dragons, travels to Westeros at the beginning of season 7. But wait, if Dany has decided to be done with diplomacy, then why does Dany not just hit King's Landing immediately? In our rewrite at this point, Tyrion is goading Dany on to do it, so why doesn't she?
I am not here to be Queen of the Ashes.
Well, first of all, just because Dany is the mother of dragons doesn't necessarily mean she's all good to go about burning the shit out of King's Landing. As we see even back in season 3 when Dany was at her most cutthroat, she still offered the chance of peace to the Masters of Yunkai. So it's not just that she's crazy violent at this point and will automatically roast anyone that's in her path, but if she does offer you peace and you refuse, well... Second, there's Varys, who's doing his best to convince her to settle the situation amicably. And it's kind of funny in the show that Dany seems to hold Tyrion in higher regard at this point, seeing as what a shit job he did at holding down the fort at Meereen, and it was Varys who actually did more to help in Meereen, and Varys was the one who recruited the Dornish and the Tyrells to her cause, even though we all know how that turned out, but yeah, whatever. So at the start of season 7, Varys is clearly winning his battle of wits with Tyrion, and it is he who wants her to win the people over before they go to King's Landing, perhaps believing that the larger the force backing them, the more likely Cersei may settle for peace. And come to think of it, now that we're talking about the battle of wits between Tyrion and Varys, let's do a bit more rewriting. Instead of Tyrion being the one whose ideas it is to have the Unsullied take Casterly Rock, and for the Ironborn fleet to escort the Dornish back to Westeros, we can have them be the ideas of Varys. But Varys is no dumb man, so why is it that these plans fail just as they did when Tyrion suggests them in the show? Well, what if Tyrion, in an attempt to turn Dany to the dark side, sabotages Varys' plans? He anonymously informs Cersei of the Ironborn fleet and the Unsullied attack on Casterly Rock, which allows the Lannisters to intervene. It would actually be brilliant on Tyrion's part, secretly helping Cersei and Euron, but having the main objective of enraging Dany enough that she says fuck Varys and takes matters into her own hands, which is what she totally does when she attacks the Lannisters on their way back from Highgarden, lose the battle to win the war. This is the beginning of Varys realizing he's starting to lose his influence over Dany. And third, Jon Snow. When Jon meets with her and tells her of the White Walker threat, he's able to convince her that even if she takes King's Landing, the army of the dead is the greater threat that must be dealt with. She can take King's Landing in the blink of an eye, so she might as well take care of the White Walkers first and perhaps win over the Northerners in the process. As for Dany's motivation being that of her romance with Jon, yeah, I'm just gonna throw that out. I think the romance between them was quite contrived and I really didn't buy it. It just really seemed random to me, and instead we could reframe it as Dany being jealous of Jon. Jon is the leader that Dany always wanted to be, loved by his own people, always about the greater good, and skilled in diplomacy, as is seen in his accomplishment of creating unity between the members of the Night's Watch and the Wildlings. He actually resembles Rhaegar in many ways. I wonder why. So perhaps it is this that draws her to him instead of his pipe game, and perhaps her time with him is bringing out the more peaceful Dany that decided to stay in Meereen. We as an audience think, well, maybe the lighter side of Dany will be inspired by Jon, and her lighter side will eventually win out over the Mother of Dragons. Maybe Jon can convince her that she still has a chance to be the magnanimous leader she always wanted to be. Well, unfortunately that goes to shit in Season 8. Despite her best to win over the people of the North, her failed interactions with the Northerners and her conflict with Sansa, and their praise of Jon over her after the Battle of Winterfell, and after Jon's true parentage is revealed, and Dany discovers that Varys is planning on usurping her for Jon, and after Missandei is killed by Cersei, this is what drives Dany to the brink of madness, basically making her warp Digivolve from the Mother of Dragons to Mad Queen Dany. And this is much to Tyrion's delight, at least initially, but once he starts to come out of his vengeful rage, he starts to reconsider if he's done the right thing. Again, Mad Queen Dany is actually in line with the evolution of her character, but you can't just pack all that shit into less than 2 episodes. If they had done a better job at spreading this out from her arrival at Westeros at the beginning of Season 7 to the Battle of King's Landing, then it would at least seem a little bit less contrived. I think if they had actually sprung for 2 full-length seasons, Season 7 and 8, each with 10 episodes, this probably could have been done. And now we come to Dany's destruction of King's Landing. And as I said before, I found this to be contrived as fuck. My main gripe is the lack of motivation for Dany's actions in this very moment. Viewers can argue whether or not Dany would do something like this, or if she's even capable of doing so, but no one seems to explain why she does it. I mean, the battle's over. Just roll up to the Red Keep and get Cersei. By killing the civilians, all this does is make shit way worse for Dany, as her allies will surely view her as a tyrant. Was she trying to get revenge on Cersei for Missandei? Well, this is kinda dumb, seeing as Cersei couldn't give a fuck about her people, so killing them isn't gonna do anything. Was she trying to instill fear in Jon and the others in case they ever decided to cross her? Well, I'd probably say that having Drogon is more than enough persuasion than she's ever going to need. Did she just snap in the moment? Well, this is even dumber and a cheap excuse to make a character do something you wanted to happen instead of making the action happen organically and believably. It just seemed to me to be completely unnecessary in the context of the story. But what if we were able to make it necessary? What if Dany needed to kill innocent civilians in order to take King's Landing? How could the writers have done this? Easily. That's how. The solution is so obvious, it's almost painful they didn't think of it. You see these? These are called scorpions. And it's established in as early as Season 7 that they have the ability to injure and even kill a dragon. Yet, as we see in Episode 5, they're easily dispatched with dragonfire. Well, what if Cersei didn't put the scorpions up on the wall of King's Landing where Dany could easily destroy them? What if instead of putting the scorpions here, she put them on the streets of King's Landing? And Cersei, being the crazy bitch she is, surrounds each of these scorpions with hundreds of civilians. And Cersei does this knowing that, best case scenario, if Dany hesitates long enough for the scorpions to kill Drogon, then Dany has lost her edge and the Lannisters may have a shot at holding King's Landing. But even if Drogon is able to destroy the scorpions and Cersei is killed, it will come at the cost of Dany killing thousands of innocent people, which may just turn the rest of Westeros against her. Even if she loses, Cersei may still get the last laugh over Dany, even in death. So let's break it down. Dany and co arrive at King's Landing. Dany is easily able to destroy the Iron Fleet and some scorpions upon the city walls. But then she realizes there are scorpions on the city streets, and they are surrounded by civilians. Dany is unable to destroy the scorpions without killing civilians, so she must weave and dodge their projectiles. Meanwhile, Jon and those fighting for Dany make their way into the city, hoping to make it to the scorpions and dispatch them before Drogon is killed. But unfortunately, they run smack into the Golden Company, who are inside the walls of the city, instead of just stupidly chilling out front like sitting ducks. From the sky, Dany sees Jon and her forces being hindered by the Golden Company, knowing that if they cannot get to the scorpions in time, Drogon may be killed. And you know what? Let's up the ante. Instead of having Rhaegal die in the dumbest way possible in Episode 4, what if Rhaegal assaulted King's Landing on his own along with Dany and Drogon? And Rhaegal is killed by the scorpions here at King's Landing, putting more pressure on Dany to make a decision. And now we've come to Dany's final dilemma. We finally see the two warring factions within Dany, the magnanimous young girl who wanted to bring peace to the world and ensure not a single innocent person would ever suffer again, and the darker, conquering side of her that believes destiny foretells she is meant to sit on the Iron Throne and anyone who stands in her way must be shown no mercy. In order to win the throne, she must kill innocents. If she refuses to do so, Drogon may be killed, and the Iron Throne may slip from her grasp. And it's in this moment that Dany remembers all of those she sacrificed to bring her to where she is. Rhaegal, Missandei, Viserion, Jorah, Barristan, her husband Drogo, and, of course, her son Rhaego. Realizing that if she refuses to act, their deaths may be all in vain, Dany makes her choice. And then everything else in the finale for her is pretty much the same, except of course in our rewrite, Tyrion kills Dany rather than Jon. Now I know some of you mentioned that you didn't mind Jon killing Dany. I'm not the biggest fan of this, as I'll explain in my Jon video in a couple weeks, but even if we went with Jon killing Dany, this small adjustment in the plot would still work. But you may say, isn't the whole reason Jon killed Dany because she destroyed King's Landing unprompted? So if she's given some sort of justification as she's given in our scenario, then perhaps he wouldn't, right? Well, no, because Jon doesn't kill Dany because she torched King's Landing, at least not solely. In his conversation with Tyrion after Tyrion is imprisoned following his denouncement of Dany, even after Tyrion informs Jon what will happen if Dany is left to her own devices, Jon, this spineless wet dish towel of a character that the show writers replaced Jon with this final season, he still believes in Dany. But then Tyrion mentions that Sansa and Arya are in danger, seeing as they will never bend the knee to her, and they all know what happens when one refuses to bend the knee to Daenerys Targaryen. So even if Dany was forced, quote-unquote, to kill the civilians of King's Landing, there is still plenty of reason for Jon to decide to kill her. But as we know, in our rewrite, it is Tyrion who kills Dany for reasons outlined in his video. Dany, to thank him for his service, gives Tyrion the Hand of the Queen pin, which he stabs into her neck. Dying and bleeding, Dany looks out over her kingdom, the Kingdom of Ash. She turns to see the Iron Throne, desperately crawling, reaching out for it, for her destiny, and she slowly fades. A tragic end for a tragic character. Meanwhile, Jon watches as Tyrion is taken away by Dany's forces and... sorry. You still have to wait for Jon's video to learn the fate of Tyrion. So basically how the series is going to progress is that each 3 videos will be linked. The first trio is Tyrion, Dany, and Jon. The second will be Cersei, Jaime, and Arya, and so on and so forth. Each character's fate is related to the other 2 in their trio, so you'll have to wait for a character's trio to be complete before you will see how all 3 characters are linked. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode of GOT Rewrite. Let me know your own thoughts, observations. Does my analysis of Dany's arc throughout the series ring true, or do I sound like a nut job? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a video, and gear up because our next video will be on Jon Snow, and will serve as the conclusion for the first trio of characters, and you will learn the fates of both him and Tyrion Lannister. Stay tuned, and once again, thank you so much for the support.